Efforts in reducing the negative impact of loss of correspondent banking relationships in the Caribbean. The role of supervisors and financial institutions. Session 10. Best practices in applying ongoing AML controls. Relevance and methodology. In this section, we're going to review recommendation number 10, which is one of the most important in relation to the due diligence of the customers. And then we will review some of the best practices regarding outside supervision. And finally, the role of financial institutions in these matters. Introduction. What tells us FATF recommendation number 10 is? The CDD measures to be taken are as follows. Here we chose a paragraph related to this course. Conducting ongoing due diligence on the business relationship and scrutiny of transactions undertaken throughout the course of that relationship to ensure that the transactions being conducted are consistent with the institution's knowledge of the customer, their business and risk profile, including, where necessary, the source of funds. This means this recommendation applies to all kinds of products and services provided by financial institutions. We must be sure that the bank knows their customers, their business, their profiles, the source of funds, the final ownership, etc. About the ongoing due diligence, the interpretive note of this recommendation established that financial institutions should be required to ensure that documents, data, or information collected under the CDD process is kept up to date and relevant by undertaking reviews of existing records, particularly for higher risk categories of customers. Even though the customers of correspondent banking relationships are not categorized as high risk, for these customers, financial institutions must focus on individual interests because, well, they need to keep the information updated. Here we must remember that FATF recommendations comes with interpretive notes and methodology for assessing technical compliance and effectiveness of AML systems. In the immediate outcome 3, referred as to the supervisors, supervision and monitoring address and mitigate the money laundering and terrorist financing risks in the financial and other relevant sectors by promptly identifying, remedying, and sanctioning where appropriate violations of AML CFT requirements or failings in money laundering and terrorist financing risk management. Moreover, the referred document provides as core issues information to be considered in determining if the outcome is being achieved, among others. The following: to what extent are remedial actions and/or effective, proportionate, and dissuasive sanctions applied in practice? In this section, the outcome number 3 takes into consideration if these actions are dissuasive, information on supervision, frequency, scope, and nature of monitoring and inspections, on-site and off-site, nature of breaches identified, sanctions, and other remedial actions, corrective actions, reprimands, fines applied. Examples of these cases where sanctions and other remedial actions have improved AML CFT compliance. This is what FATF asked to do in order to the AML CFT compliance. As suggested in the previous text, applying AML CFT ongoing controls can be analyzed from 2 points of view. First, from the supervision, ongoing controls will be focused on supervised institutions. And from the financial institution's point of view, now this means the ongoing controls will be focused on clients. Regardless of the point of view from which this issue is addressed, the importance of applying ongoing control lies in the effectiveness of the AML CFT system and, consequently, in their capability to combat de-risking. If there is proof that financial institutions and AML systems are robust and strong enough, it is less likely that their correspondent banks will apply a measure of de-risking. For this reason, we'll divide this session into 2 aforementioned points of view, but in both cases emphasizing their importance as one same tool to reduce de-risking. Finally, and due to the reasons mentioned before, we point out that this session must be read in combination with the concepts reviewed in Session 2, FATF methodology to assess technical compliance and the effectiveness of the AML CFT systems. Weaknesses identified in Caribbean RSA. Session 4, importance of AML supervision as a tool to reduce de-risking. In Session 8, weaknesses identified in Caribbean financial institutions. So let's start with the regulation and supervision authorities and how the ongoing controls focused on supervised institutions should be applied. Here you can see a model of supervision process and tools. Remember, it is just a model that reviews all the phases established by the AML compliance officer, and it shows how a supervisor can plan the supervision activities. First of all, supervisors must do a MLFT risk assessment in terms of customers, regions they work with, etc. In the small graphic on the left, you can see how you can categorize by colors, red, yellow, and green, the clients as low, medium, and high risk. After doing the MLFT risk assessment, we go to the planning stage by resuming the results of the previous assessment depending on the quality and quantity of information we have, and score it depending on the number of agencies, personal tools they work with, the number of sanctions they've had, if they were involved in any negative news about ML efficiency, quality of the corporate government, etc. When doing the planning, it is important to consider the framework of the supervisory sideboard. For instance, here the supervisory sideboard is 4 years. It means the supervision must be performed once every 4 years. For the cases of high-risk institutions, there is a revision every year. For the medium risk is twice during the 4-year period, and the low-risk institutions at least one during the 4 years also. When doing the planning, supervisors not only define the date of the supervision, but also what they're going to look for. And that is why the risk assessment is so important, because not all financial institutions have the same issues. For example, if there's a systematic institution, you can see how they work along with their partners, the exchange of information, the tools available, the transfer funds system, etc. On the other hand, if there's a small institution, supervisors look for the governance structure. Then we go to the execution part. Here must be applied the guides developed before the cycle. The on-site supervision can be ordinary or special verification visits. This classification corresponds to ordinary visits are planned in the second stage. However, if there's news that involves one of the supervised entities, there is a need to conduct a special verification visit even though it hasn't been planned. The execution time goes from 5 to 7 days, and in the communication stage, a memorandum or official letter is sent to communicate the findings and points considered to be corrected or improved. Last part, the monitoring stages belong to the off-site supervision. Here the AM applying to the regulatory report is reviewed as the follow-up of the recommendations that have been made in the memorandum or official letter, any significant changes made to the AML system, the correspondent bank risk exposure, and the quality of information provided to FIU and other authorities. Here's an example of criteria used in Peru to perform the MKFT risk assessment. There's taken into consideration the results of previous on-site activities, the sanctions, the quality of reports, the suspicious activities reports versus assets, the SAR versus number of customers, the quality of the MLFT risks management program, the geographic risk analysis before the beginning of the revision cycle, the number of agencies and AML staff, the correspondent banking risk exposure and the branches and subsidiaries in other countries. These items give a final score from 5 to 1, being 5 the highest and 1 the lowest. In the graphic you can see in the red the highest risk companies and in green the banks with the lowest risk. Now we can see how the on-site supervision process works. As already mentioned, the first step corresponds to the MLFT risk assessment. Then in the planning section must be performed a visit directive. It is a planning memorandum with the items that are going to be taken into consideration, like AML structure and internal regulations, staff, corresponding banks due diligence, MLFT risk methodologies and models, records and process to evaluate unusual activity in other AML tools. The execution can last up to 10 days. Requirements or data information, sample testing on records, customer files, etc., review internal regulations, and interviews with people involved. After the 10 days, we communicate with the entities the preliminary findings, then the institutions has to answer this communication with questions or replies on the content. And then a final report is issued and sent to the board of directors to be reviewed in the committee of directors' upcoming meeting. They have five days to answer the memorandum with time and dates they're going to comply with the recommendations. Then comes the monitoring report where we evaluate the status of recommendations every 3 months and where the company has the obligation to send a status report of the recommendation. If we have found that there's any points that are not complying with the AML regulations, supervisors start a sanction proposal and final resolution, which is the general criteria we apply on-site supervision. First, we see the general framework for MLFT risk management, the roles and responsibilities, assessment of policies and procedures, internal regulations, group policies, and the training. About the due diligence procedures, we look for the customer due diligence or CDD, employees and third parties due diligence, correspondent banks due diligence, and the transfer of funds. When reviewing the MLFT risk management methodology, must be evaluated the identification and assessment of MLFT risk methodology, the assessment of the customer's MLFT risk rating methodology, the assessment of new products and/or changes of products and new technologies, and the assessment of new geographical areas. About information and communication procedures must be reviewed the compliance officer's reports. The software for MLFT risk management, how are implemented the communication channels. This is very important. The employee must have the tools to communicate a red flag or suspicious activity to the compliance officer, and if they have any doubts about a customer, for instance. Also, we see the record keeping as FATF recommendations established. And finally, the regulatory reports. Regarding to warning signs and unusual activities, supervisors check how a red flag becomes an unusual activity and when it becomes a suspicious activity. Finally, supervisors see the internal and external audit reports and monitoring of observations as well as the internal and external audit reports. Another aspect is how well is implemented the superintendency of banking or similar competent bodies. It depends on the institutions. For example, if there's a supervision on a government bank, it must be reviewed by the national controlling bodies. Off-site supervision is quite important for the AML system. First of all, we should focus on the licensing process. When an entrance of a new financial institution is approved, has to be checked how the officer compliance is composed and the licensing process. Of new financial institutions, corporate compliance officer, product approval to the simplified CDD regime. In the Peru case, for instance, there are some questionnaires to know. Exposure to MLFT risks, sent once a year by the company. Management of MLTF risks in economic groups, conducted once along the cycle. Diagnosis of correspondent banking, done twice a year. And diagnosis of fund transfer services. Here we can see how the fund transfer services process complies with the regulations and FTF recommendation number 16. Also, supervisors review the semi-annual reports of the compliance officer, the external and internal audit reports, and the off-site supervisions. Also, periodic meetings with compliance officers. For instance, the meetings of insurance and microfinance associations. Finally, the information provided by the FIU regarding the quality of the regulatory reports provided by the financial institutions. The FIU report shows the quality of the information sent, and if there are some fails in the quality, supervisors will contact the institution in order to find the way to improve what is missing. About on-site supervision process. We already mentioned the requirements, but mainly what has to be reviewed are the manual and internal procedures of CDD KYC, the list of all customers of the financial institution, the list of PEP, political exposed persons, customers, and the list of clients subject to the enhanced CDD regime. Then supervisors evaluate the procedures assessment. The financial institution has properly determined its customers. How are the procedures to identify customers that will be subject to enhanced CDD measures? They establish de-risking procedures, and if the compliance officer has unrestricted access to the customer's information, that allows him to perform his functions. Sometimes it's found out that the company has complete information about the customer, but commercial areas don't share that info with the compliance officer due to internal bureaucracy. A sample requirement is also important, and here supervisors evaluate a sample of customer files requested to be delivered physically or electronically, depending on the number of customers of the FI. The files contain customer identification information, applied verification procedures, customer's MLFT risk rating, information regarding the contracting of financial products, services. Then we have the customer subject to simplified and general regime. And supervisors focus on the enhanced regime. The reason is because these are the customers that represent the highest risk in the company, and supervisors must see how they monitor their activities and where the funds come from. Now we're going to review financial institutions and the ongoing controls focused on clients. As mentioned before, supervision has two sides. The supervision side we have reviewed and the financial institution side. As starting point for the ongoing controls application, it is important to mention the customer risk profile. When a customer becomes a client of the company, the institution must do a customer risk profile to see how is the level of intrinsic risk of the client and to know where in the market segment will be allocated. These customer profiles should be able to determine the level and type of ongoing monitoring. If we don't know the client, how will we know what type of monitoring work must be applied? It should be able to support the bank's decision of whether to continue or to terminate the business relationship. Whenever a bank ends a financial relationship with a customer due to deficiency, they should keep the record of the CAP and must be available for supervisors to review. The key points, ongoing CDD monitoring, are the consistency of the transactions, the identifications of changes in the customer profile, and updating of customer profile. Transparency of criteria applied to decide the frequency and intensity of the monitoring of different customer segments should be clear for all customers. Also, the bank should have the ability to flag unusual movement of funds or transactions for further analysis, and appropriate management systems to scrutinize transactions in a timely manner. Possibility of determining when funds transactions are suspicious. In summary, Caribbean respondent banks should make periodical reviews of CDD information, adjust mitigation measures, evolution of risks, monitor clients' accounts in order to detect any changes in the transaction pattern, unusual activity, or deviations from the profile. Thank you, see you in the next section.